Hello, in this portion of the lesson, we are going to be talking about the main functions of the digestive system. That is, we are essentially going to follow the pathway of food from ingestion, so you're taking a bite out of a cookie, all the way through the digestive system. In this particular video, we are going to talk about the oral cavity through the stomach. And so just as an overview before we begin, remember that mechanical digestion is the taking large clumps of things, right? So your bite of cookie, and it is shredding that food to increase the surface area for chemical digestion to take place. And so as we're going to see as we follow this story, chemical digestion is the breaking of bonds. In the oral cavity, we actually get to start chemical digestion, physically breaking bonds of the carbohydrate polymers as well as the fat or the lipid polymers. And next, we're going to talk about the stomach. We will see how the stomach is responsible for mechanical digestion as well. It is not only a digestive organ, but also a storage organ. And so we're going to see that the stomach is churning, mixing food together with digestive juices, okay, before actually passing the food along to the small intestine. And we do get a little bit of chemical digestion, specifically of proteins and lipids, or proteins and fats. And there is minor absorption of lipid-soluble substances, but really this is negligible. So these are super tiny lipid-soluble things like alcohol and certain medications. And the small intestine is really where the bulk of the chemical digestion is going to occur. It is in this organ where we first see, and in fact, the only place where we see digestion of all four classes of biomolecules: carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Right? And actually, we need to use secretions from the pancreas as well as the liver and gallbladder, these accessory organs, in order to promote this chemical digestion. Now, also, unlike all the structures that we've seen so far, the small intestine is a powerful organ of absorption as well. And so the small intestine is very long. It has a very high surface area for the absorption, the taking of monomers across that intestinal lining and actually into our blood. Okay. Finally, by the time the food actually passes into the colon or the large intestine, there is no more chemical digestion occurring by our own enzymes. Now, that doesn't mean that the food is done being processed, but by the time the food gets to the colon, all that's left is going to be processed by bacteria, so by our gut flora. And in a future video, I'm going to talk all about those gut flora. Chemical digestion here is over by human cells. We are no longer absorbing nutrients anymore. So all of the carb, protein, lipid, and nucleic acid monomers have already been absorbed across the lining of the small intestine. Okay, so the colon get to essentially munch on whatever is left. We do get some absorption, but this is only of ions, of water, certain minerals and vitamins. So really no more nutrients, but water, salts, and smaller molecules like vitamins. Okay, so that is where we're going. Again, we are going to follow the pathway of food from taking a bite. We're starting digestion in the oral cavity. We swallow it down the esophagus, and it's going to hang out in the stomach for a little bit of time. Okay, so when you take a bite, right, ingestion, your teeth are going to begin the process of mechanical digestion. Okay, so as you are chewing using the muscles of your jaw, so here's your masseter muscle, your tongue, of course, is a series of muscles that manipulate this food into what is called a bolus, or this kind of glob of partially mechanically digested food mixed with saliva. Now, where is this saliva coming from? Well, there's actually two different main categories of salivary glands. First of all, the intrinsic salivary glands are scattered all throughout your oral cavity. They are continually secreting a little bit of saliva, and essentially this bathes over the surface of your teeth and your tongue. You swallow every once in a while to make sure that anything that's hanging out in your mouth can be swallowed and therefore digested in your stomach, right? So anything, any bacteria, any rogue food particles that have gotten stuck between your teeth or anything, they are bathed away. You swallow them, and any threats are eliminated within the acid of your stomach. Okay, so the intrinsic salivary glands are always working, but the extrinsic salivary glands are what are triggered by actually, as we're going to learn later, they are triggered by merely the thought of food. So right now we are talking about taking a bite out of a cookie. And so your mouth might be watering, right? And that is a completely normal thing. Merely the thought of food is going to trigger these extrinsic salivary glands to start releasing saliva. Now, there are three different pairs of extrinsic salivary glands. The parotid is essentially right back here by your ear. The submandibular glands are right under your mandible, and sublingual, right under the lingua, the tongue. These are right under your tongue. And so maybe you've experienced this before, but sometimes when you open your mouth, there's a little squirt of saliva that comes out, and so that feels like it's coming from underneath your tongue. That is absolutely the case. Essentially, these glands have been triggered to release a lot of saliva at once, and so sometimes you have the inopportune experience of having your mouth open when this occurs. All right, so the most active of these paired extrinsic salivary glands are the submandibular glands. Okay, so what exactly is different about this extrinsic gland saliva, and why is it only secreted essentially when we're thinking about food and we start to take a bite out of food, right? So when you're taking that bite out of your cookie, this saliva, right, of course, there's a lot more of it, is what is being mixed with that food to create a bolus. Okay, so essentially, this saliva contains mostly water, right? It is slightly acidic, but again, mostly water. It is stimulated by the chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors in your mouth, as well as the thoughts of food, of course. It is the parasympathetic nervous system that's actually going to be controlling this entire process, right? The parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest division of our nervous system. So using cranial nerves 7 and 9, we can actually trigger these extrinsic salivary glands to release mostly water into the mouth, but also electrolytes. It's a different salts. We also see bicarbonate. Remember, bicarbonate is really important in buffering the pH. Mucin, so a little bit of mucus as well. Maybe a little bit weird to think about, but metabolic wastes as well. So you might recognize these: urea, uric acid. These are actually metabolic byproducts, dealing with proteins. We generally like to think about them as being released into our urine, therefore urea or urine, but also they're being released to some extent via our saliva, and also from our sweat glands as well. So we just try to get rid of all this stuff in as many ways as possible. Okay. As we discussed in a previous section of the class, the surface barriers of our body, right, including the epithelium of our mouths, are filled with different types of compounds to reduce the risk of infection by different types of bacteria. And so this is the type of saliva that is chock full of immunoglobulin A. Right, so IgA is a type of antibody that is recognizing things that don't quite belong, that we've already seen before, that are in our mouth, but also proteins like lysozyme and defensins, also a little bit of cyanide. All of these things work together to inhibit the infection of microorganisms into our mouth, or into our body here. And actually, before we talk about these, I want to briefly mention that strong sympathetic stimulation is going to inhibit the release of all of these different things, right? So sometimes when you are stressed out, when you are panicked, when all of a sudden, you think you're getting stopped by a cop or something, oh my gosh, that's a sympathetic nervous system, and your mouth goes dry. And so the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight. We don't want to be wasting any time doing digestive stuff. And so sympathetic stimulation is going to inhibit these glands, while parasympathetic stimulation is going to promote the secretion from these glands. Okay. So to transition into the next slide here, this particular saliva also contains enzymes. All right, and so every time we see the suffix ase, this should indicate to us that this is an enzyme. It is a type of protein that specifically recognizes and can break down whatever the heck this is here. So in this case, amylase digests amylose. right? If you remember, amylose is another word for starch, right? So when you take a bite out of a French fry, this salivary amylase is what is actually being mixed with that French fry in your oral cavity. And we actually begin the digestion of starch right away. As soon as you bite that cookie, right, all of the starchy components, the flour itself is starting to be digested right away. Okay. Another enzyme that is released is called lingual lipase. And so lipase indicates it's an enzyme, LIP indicates it's breaking down lipids. So your lipids and your carbohydrates are being digested as soon as you ingest the food. Another thing that I want to point out about these enzymes is that we are going to see a lot of enzymes in this story, lots and lots of different ones. And so almost always in the enzyme name, it is going to tell you where these enzymes are coming from. So salivary amylase is released in the saliva. Lingual lipase is released onto the tongue, so it's also within the saliva, right? You would never see lingual lipase being released by the pancreas or into the small intestine, okay? Salivary and lingual enzymes are released into your saliva, into your oral cavity, okay, to begin the process of digesting carbohydrates as well as lipids. Okay, we're not digesting proteins. We're not digesting nucleic acids yet. We're only digesting carbs and fats. Okay. And so, of course, we chew up this food. We use our tongue and our teeth to manipulate the food into a bolus. Okay, and then consciously, right, purposefully, we push our tongue to the roof of our mouth, which is going to push the bolus to the back of our oral cavity. Essentially, some stretch receptors are going to be activated on the roof of your mouth, on the soft palate, initiating what is called the swallow reflex. Now, we saw what this looks like before, but just to reiterate, when the swallow reflex is initiated, essentially what's going to happen is that the soft palate is going to contract up to block food from going up and out your nose, right? We don't like that. Also, the epiglottis is pulled down over the glottis, so over the opening into your airways. Okay, and your upper esophageal sphincter is going to relax. Right, so essentially we have a couple different circular muscles that prevent your stomach acid from coming back up your esophagus and coming out through your oral cavity, right? And so this sphincter is always contracted, but as soon as we swallow, the sphincter relaxes, therefore allowing food to pass through the sphincter and into the esophagus. Now, as we saw in the video, the peristaltic waves, right? So sequential contractions pushing the food, the bolus, down the esophagus towards the stomach. Remember that this action is produced by sequential contractions of smooth muscle tissue, which is located within the Muscularis Externum, right? That layer of the digestive system wall. Again, we have another sphincter down here at the opening into the stomach. So the lower esophageal sphincter, you might have seen commercials that are advertising acid reflux medications, and they often talk about the lower esophageal sphincter because of this muscle is not always contracted. Essentially, stomach acid and all of the other goodies in your stomach can creep back up your esophagus and can, of course, agitate those delicate mucosal tissues. Okay, so the swallow reflex, again, is going to contract the soft palate and uvula up to block your nasal cavity. This directs the food down. The epiglottis is going to contract down, blocking the airways, right? So this is why you don't talk when you eat or when you swallow, because in order to talk, your airways need to be open, right? And we don't want them to be open if we are swallowing or if there's a chance that food can go down our pharynx. Okay, the upper and lower esophageal sphincters are going to relax, and peristaltic waves push the bolus down into the stomach. Okay, now the esophagus is actually going to pass through the diaphragm, and it enters or joins into the stomach at a structure called the cardiac orifice, right? And it's called the cardiac orifice because essentially your heart is right here above your diaphragm, so it's super close to where the esophagus actually meets the stomach. Okay, so the stomach, let's talk about structures. Now, As I've mentioned many times at this point, structure matches function. And so you should be thinking about the different features, the different structures in the stomach and why they would be that way, right? Why is this structure here? How does that give rise to the different unique function of this particular organ? Nice. So here is the esophagus entering into the stomach at the cardiac orifice. So the orifice is the hole itself. The region of the stomach around the cardiac orifice is called the cardiac region or the cardia. Okay. We can see that the stomach is essentially, well, it's actually essentially pushed a little bit to the left side of your abdomen. So it's on the left as opposed to the liver being on the right. The superior side of the stomach actually domes up a little bit. So this is actually going to be important to us later. This is called the fundus, so a dome-shaped region beneath the diaphragm. Okay, the stomach is roughly C-shaped, right? So this side of the stomach is the greater curvature. It's the broader side of the stomach, and over here, this is the lesser curvature. Okay, just because of the big old C shape. The entire stomach funnels down into this pyloric region over here, which technically includes the antrum, the canal, and the pylorus itself. Note that we have yet another sphincter, right, a circular muscle, which here has been sectioned through so that we can see inside the stomach. And that is called the pyloric sphincter. And essentially that is important in controlling when food passes from the stomach into the next organ in line, which is called the small intestine. Okay, so the pyloric sphincter, something we'll talk about again and again, super important. Sphincter means circular muscle. Pyloric is in the pyloric region. Okay, and then here, of course, is the beginning of the duodenum or the beginning of the small intestine. Okay, now a couple other things before we move on to the next slide. Note here that the serosa has been removed from the stomach in this region right here. So removing that outermost layer of the stomach lets us see 1, 2, and 3 layers of Muscularis Externum. Okay, so this particular layer of the stomach has 3 different layers as opposed to just 2 layers. Remember, in a previous lesson, we talked about the longitudinal and the circular layer of the Muscularis Externa. These promote peristalsis and segmentation. The stomach has a 3rd layer, right? And the fact that this is different should imply to you that the function of the stomach is very different than the other organs, okay? And so essentially, the stomach is not only pushing food along via peristalsis and segmentation, it's also a storage organ, right? So generally, the oral cavity, the esophagus, the small intestine, all of these organs are slowly but surely pushing food along, right? Food is never really supposed to be sitting in any one place for hours at a time. And so, they only need 2 layers, but in the stomach, we store food sometimes hours and hours at a time. And so while the stomach is holding this extra food, right, and stomach acid, et cetera, it is mixing it, right? So this is going to promote mechanical digestion, so further breaking up of these larger molecules, but also more mixing, more digesting is happening within the stomach. Right? So there is a longitudinal and a circular layer of the Muscularis Externa and also an oblique layer. Okay, another thing I want to point out are these little folds here, which are called rugae, which we're going to see on the next slide. Okay, so let's first zoom in on the wall of the stomach. Okay, so here's the mucosa, right? The submucosa here, which includes this tiny little the mucosa, tiny little muscle layer, which is going to control essentially the secretion from glands. The submucosa is where the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves are going to be located. The Muscularis Externa contains 1, 2, and 3 layers of muscle tissue. Okay, I guess this video is not working right now, but what the video was just showing you some a study essentially where people swallowed little capsules with tiny little cameras inside, so you can actually see the churning of the stomach. And with the little camera, people ate ramen as well. So you got to see the breakdown of ramen, which actually doesn't break down that much because there's so many darn preservatives. But anyway, the stomach has 3 layers of muscle, not just 2. Okay. The mucosa is also highly modified within the stomach. As I showed you a couple slides ago, there are these little folds or these little ridges lining this stomach. Okay, so these folds are called rugae. They are not necessarily increasing surface area for digestion. Instead, the function of these rugae is essentially allowing for expansion of the stomach. All right, so when the stomach is pretty empty, it's about ½ liter, so nice and small stomach, but then you go to the buffet and you eat plate after plate of food, and so your stomach can actually stretch to be 3, 4, 5 times its original size. Okay, and the more you habitually eat, the larger your stomach can hold. Right, and that actually makes you less sensitive to the full feeling. Okay, so these rugae essentially allow the stomach to expand without tearing that delicate mucosal lining. I want to point something out here, and we're going to come back to this. One option for a surgical weight loss solution is called a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery. And so I'm going to bring this up because it's kind of clever, and we're going to see how it fits into the function of our digestive system here. But essentially, right, esophagus to stomach, food then goes into the duodenum in a normal, unsurgically altered digestive system. Essentially, when you eat, food fills up the pyloric region first, and then the body, and then if you are super full, the fundus is going to be stretched out, right? And so when the fundus stretches, as we're going to see later, this is going to send a message to your brain that says, yo, I am full. Now, the actual message itself takes about 20 minutes to actually like sink into your brain. And again, we're going to talk about this later, but this is why you eat slowly so that you actually detect that full feeling, right? It actually takes a little while. So if you're just shoveling in food, you don't even know that your fundus is stretched. You don't even know that your entire stomach is full. Right? You just still keep on eating. Right. So the full receptors are located all the way up here within the fundus. Okay. Also, as we're going to see, there are a lot of digestive enzymes and other things that are dumped into the duodenum here. Okay. So if you want to surgically alter your digestive system to aid in your weight loss journey, what this surgery involves is essentially rerouting your small intestine to essentially bypass the duodenum, right? So you're still going to get these enzymes and everything, but there's not going to be physically as much surface area for digestion and therefore absorption to occur. So you can still eat food, but you're not actually getting as many nutrients out of that food, and therefore not as much fat, presumably, out of that food as well. Also, a lot of the stomach is bypassed, right? And so essentially, the surgery is going to reduce the size of the stomach, again, bypassing most of the stomach and the duodenum entirely by attaching the jejunum, the next part of your small intestine, to a smaller piece of the stomach. Now, in theory, this surgery could use any part of the stomach to service the stomach, but the surgery actually takes the most superior portion, right? So it is actually including those stretch receptors in the fundus. And so just a teeny little bit of food is going to stretch out that tissue. Okay. Therefore, immediately beginning the process of telling your brain, yo, I am super full right now. Okay. That's an aside for now, but as an application question, we are going to come back to that. Okay, so another way that the stomach's mucosal layer is highly modified for the function of the organ is that the cells on the very surface of the mucosal layer secrete a ton of mucus, and not just any kind of mucus, but specifically bicarbonate-rich mucus, right? So essentially, this is chock full of buffers, okay? And essentially, remember that the stomach has a really low pH, lots and lots of stomach acid, which we're going to get into here soon. So lots of stomach acid, and stomach acid would, of course, damage our delicate stomach lining, this mucosal layer. And so our surface mucus cells actually secrete a lot of mucus, which literally buffers this fluid from the super acidic pH up here. And so this protects the stomach lining cells, and also it protects the underlying tissues, because of course we don't want stomach acid to eat through these layers and then get into our blood and start degrading our capillaries. Okay. The other way that we can kind of protect the underlying tissues, protect the rest of our body, is by using lots and lots of tight junctions to essentially sew these cells together. Okay. Now, all of these things are super helpful. It's wonderful, but still there's a lot of damage that happens to the stomach surface, so much so that we literally replace our entire stomach lining once or twice a week. Okay. Another way that the stomach's mucosal layer is highly modified is that this epithelium actually dips down into the deeper layers of the stomach, forming what are called gastric pits, right? So if you look at the surface of the stomach, you see lots of little holes. They open up into glands, and the glands are lined with specialized epithelial cells, which secrete very particular things for the function of the stomach. Okay, so here we can see what this would look like under the microscope. Lots of little holes. Those are gastric pits. They open up into gastric glands. Okay, so the gastric glands secrete gastric juices. Sounds tasty, right? Well, what exactly is that? Gastric glands secrete closest to the lumen here, they secrete a watery fluid that is the juice part itself. Within these juices, these deeper cells are going to secrete different types of things depending on the cell. We have parietal cells, we have chief cells, and we have G cells, also called enteroendocrine cells. So let's see what we have here. Parietal cells, remember parietal means wall, but in this case, parietal cells are going to be responsible for essentially secreting the acid part of stomach acid. Now, hydrochloric acid is obviously very abrasive. We do not want to damage our parietal cells themselves, right? That would not be ideal. And so parietal cells actually secrete the hydrogen and the chloride separately, so that by the time these two ions get into the lumen of the stomach, they join together to make hydrochloric acid. Okay, so why do we have stomach acid in the first place? Well, first of all, acid denatures proteins, right? So that's why we don't secrete these two things together. We don't want to unravel our own proteins. But in the lumen of the stomach, which is of course isolated from the rest of the body, it's isolated from our own cells, any bacteria that we swallow is unraveled, right? It's killed right away. Any proteins we eat in our food, right? So within your cookie, within your bite of hamburger, whatever, the proteins are actually unraveled so that we can start to digest them more easily, right? So this acid of the gastric juices is essentially unraveling the proteins for digestion, as well as a protective mechanism for our body, right? We don't want bacteria to just take over from inside our stomach. Furthermore, the acid is going to activate an enzyme. Okay, so this particular enzyme, which we'll see in the next slide, is released as a zymogen from those gastric glands. And essentially, as soon as that protein enters into the lumen of the stomach, it is going to be changed. The shape is going to change because of the acid, and that activates the protein. And the other thing that parietal cells are going to do is release something called intrinsic factor. Now, we talked about this a little bit in the beginning of the semester, but essentially intrinsic factor is a secretion by these parietal cells that is absolutely required to absorb vitamin B12. Remember, vitamin B12 is critical in making red blood cells, right? Generally, it is found in animal products, right? So when you eat that hamburger, it's filled with vitamin B12, but even if you're eating tons of this vitamin, you can't actually absorb it into your body and use it unless you also are making intrinsic factor. Okay, so again, parietal cells release hydrogen and chloride to make the acid, as well as intrinsic factor. Now, the second of these three main types of cells I want to talk about are the chief cells. These are the ones that actually release this zymogen. Right, so the zymogen's name is pepsinogen. Right, so this here is a chief cell. It releases pepsinogen into the lumen of the stomach. As soon as pepsinogen encounters hydrochloric acid, the shape changes and now it is activated. Right, so pepsin is an activated protease, that is, it digests proteins. And so any protein that is in your food can now be broken down into its individual amino acid components. Okay, so protein digestion occurs within the stomach. Okay, secondly, gastric lipase. All right, so lipase digests lipids, just like we saw with lingual lipase. This one is gastric lipase, meaning that it is in the stomach. And so the parietal cells release this enzyme into the lumen of the stomach. This here is a triglyceride, a type of lipid, and gastric lipase is going to start pulling fatty acids off of those triglycerides. So this is literally breaking down the fats into their individual monomer form. All right, remember that lingual lipase was responsible for doing this in the oral cavity. Right? As soon as lingual lipase as well as salivary amylase gets into the stomach, those proteins unravel and they are no longer working. Right? As soon as the pH changes, all of a sudden, those enzymes aren't in their ideal conditions, so they can no longer work. Right? So salivary enzymes work in the mouth, they work in the esophagus, and they don't work anymore. Stomach enzymes only work in a really acidic pH. So pepsin and gastric lipase are breaking down proteins and lipids, no carb digestion, no nucleic acid digestion in the stomach. Okay, the final type of cell that I want to talk about in these gastric glands are called the enteroendocrine cells. So endocrine, meaning that they release hormones into the blood to control other things. Entero for gut. So this is the bottom of one of these gastric glands. These little green cells here are representing the enteroendocrine cells, also called the G cells. And they're called the G cells because they release gastrin. Okay, so gastrin is a hormone that is incredibly important in the regulation of the digestive system. Okay, so G cells, gastrin. Okay, and there's a lot of other hormones that are released by these cells. We're not really going to focus on them very much. One of them is somatostatin. You also have things like histamine and other types of things. The one I want you to remember is gastrin. All right, so essentially gastrin is going to be released anytime food enters into your stomach, and gastrin promotes stomach activity, right? It's going to suppress other things that are going on in your body and promote whatever is happening in the stomach. Okay, so this here is summarizing these different types of cells. Remember, the surface mucus cells are going to essentially protect the lining of your stomach, so really alkaline rich mucus. These mucus neck cells are just going to release fluid into which the secretion of the chief cells and the parietal cells is going to reside. Right? Chief cells primarily release pepsinogen as well as gastric lipase. Parietal cells are going to release HCl, right, to activate pepsinogen into pepsin, as well as to denature proteins, and intrinsic factor as well. Collectively, these things are called the gastric juices. Okay. Finally, the G cells are going to release hormones. Okay. So instead of releasing contents into the pits and therefore into the stomach itself, the hormones are released into the blood to control a larger number of organs. Okay. So this is just for your study purposes. Last thing that I want to mention in this video is gastric or peptic ulcers. Essentially, this is just to reiterate the importance of this very alkaline rich mucus here. If there is damage to these cells, right, or if there's an infection by H. pylori, essentially this mucus is no longer enough to protect our cells. And so the stomach acid that we ourselves produce for our own digestive processes can actually start to erode the lining of our stomach right? And if there are holes in our stomach lining, essentially that acid and all of those maybe not digested things, including bacteria, can leak out of our stomach into our surrounding abdomen. Of course, this is very uncomfortable. It causes lots of inflammation, etc. So that is the end of this clip. To be continued in the small intestine.